Rose Clark Ambler was 23 years old and 3 months from her wedding when she said goodnight to her fiancé at the Raven Stream Bridge. It was a Sunday evening in early September 1883. The road home ran 1.5 miles through the country outside Stratford, Connecticut, past elms and maples that swallowed the dark. There were perhaps 50 houses between the bridge and her father's door. The newspapers would later say the night was so black she could not have seen her own hand. William Lewis offered to walk her the rest of the way. She told him no. He had to be up before sunrise. He sold vegetables in Bridgeport, and his day began early. She had walked the road many times. She kissed him at the bridge and went on alone. A storm was gathering. Rose knew the road, and the road knew her. Tonight it carried her past the second fork and into the meadows where the cornfields began, and from there toward home. She had been married once, briefly. She had a 3-year-old daughter, a divorce no one in Stratford had forgiven her for, and a man she loved waiting on the other side of autumn, a man building a house for them both, in time for Thanksgiving. 3 months from now. Tonight there were only the trees, the road, and the dark. She would not reach her father's house. The next morning, a farm boy driving cattle up a lane would find her by a stone wall, lying as if asleep. The case would never be solved. And 9 years later, in a hospital bed, the man who had walked her to the bridge would say something that might have been a confession, or might have meant nothing at all. At 7 the next morning, a farm boy named Charles Mason was driving Preston Hodges's cows out to pasture. Mason worked on the Hodges farm. The cows knew the lane. He walked behind them. 2 other workers from the next farm joined him on the path. The 3 of them came up between the stone walls in the September light and saw a woman lying in the grass beside one of them. She was on her back. Her clothes were arranged. From a distance, she looked as if she had stopped to rest and fallen asleep. They went closer. There was froth at her mouth and dark marks on either side of her throat. She had lost an earring. It would later turn up inside her hat. They knew her at once. Almost everyone in Stratford did. She was Captain Nate Clark's middle daughter, and she had been engaged to be married at Thanksgiving. She lay 200 feet from Preston Hodges's front door, not far from a hedge where she could have been hidden for days. Mason ran for the house. The papers, in the days that followed, would print rumors of stabbings and beatings, the kind of details a country town invents when it has no answer. The autopsy was simpler. Rose Ambler had been strangled. She had not been outraged. She had bled from no wound. She had been killed quickly, by hands, on a road she had walked since childhood. Rose was the 3rd daughter of Captain Nathan Clark. Captain Clark, Nate to everyone in Stratford, had 9 children and a small fleet. He was a fisherman and shipowner who worked the Connecticut waters and ran his vessels up Long Island Sound and out into Vineyard Sound when the season called for it. He was the kind of man a Connecticut town in 1883 admired without fully knowing, respected, dutiful, in his pew on Sundays, harder to read across a kitchen table. The town newspapers, which loved a respectable family, noted that the Clark daughters were remarkable for their beauty and the Clark sons for being industrious, sober, and respectable. Captain Clark himself was highly esteemed, which, in a small town, often means a man it will not lend money to. Stratford in 1883 was farms and meadows and stone walls, with elms older than anyone living. Most people knew most people. There was a Methodist church, a reverend, and rumors that traveled faster than horses. Captain Clark's daughter Rose was, by Stratford's account, beautiful. The New Haven Register was less generous. She was, the paper wrote, hardly up to the average in good looks, but intelligent, highly esteemed, universally liked. Both descriptions were true in their own way. Rose Clark was a young woman people liked. She became engaged at 18 to a sailor whose name the papers never published. He went to sea and stayed longer than expected. Word eventually reached her that he was alive and well somewhere on the water. By then, Rose Clark had decided she would not wait. Newspapers later said she lacked patience or had married to avoid being humiliated by an absent fiancé. They were not fair, and they rarely were with women in her position. The man she chose was Norman Ambler. He was a vegetable farmer outside town, the son of a man who had grown wealthy on government war contracts during the Civil War. Norman himself was described in the press as a happy-go-lucky fellow, fond of drink, fond of his own strength, easily led by the company he kept. He courted Rose for a month, perhaps two. They were married inside a season. A daughter was born to them within the year. The newspapers almost never mentioned the child when they later wrote about Rose. She would be 3 years old in the autumn of 1883. The marriage did not last that year out. It did not last, in part, because Norman Ambler brought his cousin to live in their house. William Lewis was a distant cousin of Norman Ambler's and a better salesman than Norman would ever be. Norman raised the vegetables. Lewis sold them out of a carriage on a daily route through Bridgeport, where he had built up a clientele of housewives, innkeepers, and hotel cooks who waited each morning for his cart. He was, in the press's later description, an ideal Connecticut countryman: oiled hair, bushy blonde whiskers, blue flannel clothes. He had a salesman's voice and a salesman's instinct for what a person wanted to hear before they had fully decided they wanted it. When he came to live in the Ambler house and work the family business, no one in Stratford thought much of it. Cousins did business together. Cousins lived under the same roof. The arrangement was practical. Norman knew the soil. Lewis knew the city. Money moved through both their hands. Rose kept house. Lewis was also jealous. The town would learn that later. Rose began going with him on the rounds. It started, as these things often do, with errands: a delivery, a stop at the bank, a parcel for someone in town. Lewis drove. Rose rode beside him. It was not unusual at first for a young wife to ride with her husband's cousin on the day's business. It became unusual when the carriage was seen out past midnight, and then past 2 in the morning, on roads that were not part of any route the family ran. Rumors traveled Stratford the way rumors travel small towns, fast, imperfectly, attaching themselves to a name little by little. They reached Norman. Lewis moved out of the household and into his mother's place down the road. The carriage rides did not stop. Rose visited him there. Norman later told Coroner Holt that his wife had said directly she cared more for William Lewis than for him. He said he protested what he called her unwifely conduct. Rose did not answer the way he wanted. The marriage came apart in the way marriages came apart in 1883. In court, with paperwork, and in the newspapers. Constable Dufour brought Norman the divorce summons in his own kitchen. Norman read it and refused to answer. The divorce was granted on Rose's petition, by default, in a small Connecticut courtroom that had seen tidier dissolutions and worse ones. Rose moved back to her father's house 2 miles up the road. Norman stayed on the farm with his widowed mother and the 3-year-old girl. He kept drinking. Before Rose left him, he had been a man who drank in company. Afterward, he drank harder, more often and sometimes alone. He kept the farm running. He kept the daughter fed. He did not speak to Rose again, at least in any surviving record. But one thing he said before the divorce would come back into the case after her death. Annie Wetzel, Lewis's sister, told it first to Lewis. Lewis passed it on. Rose's mother, Jenny Clark, heard it from Annie Wetzel and remembered it. The deputy coroner heard it from Jenny Clark. Norman had told William Lewis, sometime before the wedding that never happened, that he should never marry Rose Ambler. "Either you," Norman had said, "or she shall die first." After the divorce, Rose Clark, she had taken back her father's name, and William Lewis stopped pretending. He came to her father's house openly. She visited him at his mother's and made no secret of it. They were to be married at Thanksgiving. Lewis had begun that summer to build a new house for the two of them. He bought the lumber, lined up the carpenter, and paced out where the rooms would go. Through the late summer of 1883, anyone passing the property could see it taking shape, raw and unpainted, on a piece of ground a few miles from Captain Clark's place. Rose walked the road between the two houses often. In the afternoon, at dinner time, late at night after visits had run long and the lamps in the Lewis house had been turned down, she walked it alone. It was a courtesy to Lewis, who began work before sunrise, and it was habit. Stratford was peaceful. The road was familiar. The country turnpike ran straight a while, then forked at the Raven Stream Bridge, ran again past the houses on the way into town, forked once more, and opened out among cornfields and meadows before coming to her father's gate. She had walked it many times. She knew where the trees thickened, where the wall ran, where the cornfield began. She had 3 months left to wait. The wedding was set for Thanksgiving. The house was almost ready. The dress had been planned. Sunday, September 2nd, 1883. Rose spent the evening at the Lewis house. They had supper. They sat. The exact talk between them is not preserved, but the night took shape later through witnesses who spoke to the deputy coroner. Around 9:30, Rose got up to leave. Lewis offered, as he often did, to walk her home. Rose, as she often did, told him no. He had work in the morning. The route to Bridgeport began before sunrise. She had walked the road many times, in light, in dusk, in dark. He took up his coat anyway and walked her out as far as the Raven Stream Bridge. The bridge sat where the country turnpike crossed a small stream running out of the meadows. By day it was unremarkable. Planks, rails, water below. At night it was a marker in the dark. The place where one road ended and another began. They stood there for a moment. Lewis turned back toward his mother's house. Rose went on. The road past the bridge climbed through ordinary country. Cornfields on either side, low stone walls, a meadow or two, a hedge along the second turn that rose nearly to the height of a tall man. There were no street lamps. The houses were set back. Their windows did not reach the path. The night was black. The papers later said Rose could not have seen her own hand. Above the meadows, the storm that had been gathering all evening began to break. The first thunder rolled over the elms. The wind moved. Somewhere on the road home, Rose Ambler stopped walking. Witnesses later gave 2 partial descriptions. Edward Bertram had seen her earlier on the path with a man, a tall man whose face he could not make out. Julia Roberts had seen a man behaving strangely near the bridge that night. Neither could name him. The man on the road was never identified. What happened to Rose Ambler between the bridge and the wall by Preston Hodges's meadow is the part of the story Stratford never recovered. She was alive when she left William Lewis at the bridge. She was alive an hour later when someone was waiting for her on the road, or coming up behind her, or standing where she had not expected anyone to stand. The thunderstorm reached full strength around 11. At 11:45 that night, in a house near the road by the meadows, several people woke up. The house belonged to Preston Hodges, a retired farmer with land about 1,000 feet from Captain Clark's gate. Hodges was older and kept early hours. That summer his 2 grown daughters were staying with him, Mrs. Isbell and Mrs. Mary Merrill, who had brought her husband. Mr. Merrill, who suffered from heart palpitations and slept lightly because of them. The thunderstorm was at its loudest when the scream came. It was a single sound, sharp, very close. Mr. Merrill's heart kicked into a faster beat. Mrs. Isbell sat up. Hodges, in the next room, came partway out of sleep. They listened. There was rain. There was wind. There was no second cry. After a moment, Mr. Hodges said what people say when they want to go back to sleep, that it had been an owl. The trees along that road were full of them. An owl screech on a stormy night can sound very like a woman. The household believed him. They went back to bed. It was the only sound any of them heard from outside that night. Captain Nate Clark was at sea. The Connecticut fishing boats worked the waters down past Long Island, sometimes as far as Vineyard Sound. And that Sunday night and into Monday morning, Captain Clark was somewhere off the Vineyard, going about the work he had done every season of his life. He did not know yet that one of his children was lying in a meadow back in Stratford, 200 feet from a comfortable house, with morning coming on. The news traveled the way bad news travels, slowly at first, then very fast. Charles Mason ran for the Hodges house. The men in the household came to the wall and saw what he had seen. Word went down the lane to a neighbor with a horse, then into Stratford, then out to the harbor where the fishing boats came in, and from there by signal until it reached the deck. Captain Clark was standing on somewhere off the Vineyard. He cried out. The report said the words that entered every newspaper carrying the story. "My God, my Rose murdered," then he fell. He went down on the deck of his own boat. The men around him caught what they could. He was 60 miles from his daughter's body, and he had to be brought home before he could see what had been done to the girl, who had walked out of his house and never come back. A father heard that his daughter had been killed. He cried out her name and went down. The first man Stratford accused was Boston White. White was young, black, and known in town to keep difficult company, which, in a Connecticut country town in 1883, was enough. By the morning of September 3, before the deputy coroner had been summoned, before the inquest had convened, before any examination of the body had been completed, the talk had begun. A black man had killed Captain Clark's daughter. Stratford knew which black man it would be. A group of citizens, the better word is mob, went to the house where Boston White lived with his mother. They forced the door and made his mother bring out her son's clothing for inspection. They were looking for blood. There was no blood on the clothing, because there was no blood from Rose Ambler's body. They had not waited long enough to know that Boston White was not in Stratford that night. He had been at the Stratford Methodist Church for Sunday service, in a pew that several witnesses later placed him in. After the service, he had gone 2 miles to a stable and slept in a carriage. Where 3 more men saw him at the hour the scream was heard at Hodges's house. He had no alibi gap. He had a chorus of alibi. Stratford did not entirely care. Rose's mother did. Jenny Clark, who that morning had become a woman whose middle daughter was lying under a sheet in a back room, said before any forensic examination had been performed that she did not believe Boston White had anything to do with her child's death. She said it more than once, to enough people that the papers carried it. The mother of the murdered girl, refusing the answer her town wanted. A few days later, Professor White of Yale Medical School, no relation to Boston White, examined what had been found beneath Rose Ambler's fingernails: skin, hair, blood. Under the microscope, he concluded that the matter belonged to a white person. Boston White was cleared by science and by Jenny Clark. Deputy Coroner J.A. Joyce had by then opened a closed-door inquest in Stratford. The Pinkerton Agency sent a detective named J.S. Wood. A reward of $300 was posted, and soon raised to $1,000. The coroner's inquest ran somewhere between a hearing and a trial in a back room without the public. Its findings did not bind a court. The inquest turned to other men. 5 other men passed through the inquest. None held. Michael Heslin was an acquaintance of Boston White's, White, and missing a finger from one hand. The bruises on Rose's throat had been made, the doctor said, by 3 deep scratches that suggested a hand with fewer than 5 fingers. So the inquest looked at Heslin briefly. Witnesses who had seen the figure with Rose on the bridge knew him and were certain it was not him. There was a man at a Stratford hotel whose name the press never published. Local women had complained about his behavior. For a few days, he was suspected of being the unidentified figure on the road. He was never identified. Charles H. Rugg was a black man under indictment in Long Island City for the strangulation of 2 women. He had been seen in Stratford. He fit the method. He denied involvement. Professor White's finding closed the question. In 1905, a Pennsylvania life convict named J.H. Leroy gave a confession. Tommy Gardiner had killed Rose Ambler. Connecticut, by then 22 years on, treated the claim as the rambling of an unwell man. That left L.S. Curtis. Curtis was a Philadelphian boarding on Main Street with a man named Samuel Benjamin and Benjamin's daughter Eva. He was new to town, recently divorced, large of build, and described by one paper as a strange man with a stranger history. He showed little visible interest in the case. Detectives took that for evidence and searched his room. They found 2 stained handkerchiefs in a satchel, one cologne-scented and dark with dirt and small blood spots, one red enough to suggest blood clots when held to the light. They found 3 dirty shirts. One had blood stains, a damp collar, and rumpled cuffs. Curtis broke down a few days later. He fled to a cousin's house and stood in the doorway crying, "Save me, save me. The detectives are after me. Here they come, here they come." It was not evidence of murder. By the end of the autumn, the inquest had dismissed him. 2 suspects remained. The first was Norman Ambler. The threat, "Either you or she shall die first," had reached the inquest through Rose's mother. Coroner Holt heard it from Jenny Clark, then from Annie Wetzel. Norman did not deny saying it. In his own testimony, he spoke of Rose with bitterness that made denial unnecessary. She had betrayed him. Lewis had taken her. "I think Will Lewis can tell me all about it," he said. "No other man came around and made trouble between me and my wife but him." The unidentified figure who had walked with Rose toward the bridge, taller, partly seen, never named, was, in some Stratford theories, Norman in disguise. On the night Rose died, Norman was not in Stratford. He was 40 miles away, in New Milford, asleep in the home of a man named Henry Hatch. Hatch took him in after the divorce. Hatch swore, flatly, and on the record, that Norman had been in his bed all night. 40 miles in 1883 was not a distance a man slipped across in the dark and back again before breakfast. The inquest accepted the alibi. What it could not accept, and did not pretend to, was Norman's grief. He did not seem to feel any. He had loved Rose, he said, and the men who knew him before the divorce believed it. After her death, he drank harder than before. He was left on the farm outside town with his widowed mother and the 3-year-old girl who had been Rose's daughter, and was now, in every meaningful sense, no one's. He gave the inquest his bitterness, his alibi, and his accusation. The inquest moved on to the man he had accused. William Lewis had a solid alibi, too. The inquest spent 4 weeks taking it apart. He testified that he had walked Rose to the Raven Stream Bridge, said goodnight, gone home, and gone to bed. He had not taken the carriage out again. He had not left the house. He had slept until morning and heard nothing. His alibi began to fray. A neighbor, Frank Curtis, said he had seen Lewis driving his carriage in an ox pasture that night. Mrs. E. Osborne said Lewis had told her, on a different day, that he had been up all day and part of the night. A Shelton expressman named George Smith said he had seen Lewis at the Birmingham Savings Bank, transacting business with the air of a man preparing to leave town. A Birmingham restaurant keeper named William Smith told the inquest the most striking thing of all. Lewis had come into his place the morning after the murder and said, "If I were in Stratford, I could put my hand on the man who killed Rose." There were physical details, too. The deputy coroner had noticed scratches on the back of Lewis's right hand during questioning. Lewis hid the hand. When pressed, he denied any scratches. By the time he was asked to show it, the marks were gone. The bloodstains on his lap robe, examined by Professor White, turned out to be syrup or molasses, and that piece of evidence cleared him. But fibers from the lap robe matched fibers found on Rose's clothing, and Rose's clothes were dry the morning the body was found, despite the storm, which suggested to investigators that she had been killed somewhere under cover and laid out by the wall afterward. He showed no grief. He went, in the days after Rose's death, to beer saloons. Asked about the murder, he said, in the hearing of more than one person, "What in hell do I care about it?" The Reverend Dr. M. Houghton of the Church of the Messiah in Stratford used his pulpit for the first sermon. He said that Lewis's conduct showed him to be a man of low animal instincts, exactly the type of individual to commit such a horrible deed. In 1883 Connecticut, a sermon could function as a public accusation. The sermon was reprinted as far away as New York. Lewis's vegetable business, in the weeks after the sermon, did better than ever. New customers came on the Bridgeport route to look at him. He had to carry, the papers wrote, twice his usual produce. On September 29, 1883, 26 days after Rose's body was found, the inquest closed. The verdict was read into the record in the language of a Connecticut coroner's jury that had stopped just short of a finding. "We find that," said Rose Ambler, "came to her death by being choked to death at the hands of some person or persons to the jury unknown. But from William Lewis's connection with her in the past, and from his testimony, and from his conduct since her death, and from evidence, we think suspicion points toward him." No charge was filed. In the months that followed, the country looked at Connecticut. Mark Twain wrote in his notebook, "He killed a woman in Con. No matter. It is a crime they do not punish there. He had reason to make the joke." Mary Stannard in Madison in 1873, killed by a Methodist minister and never convicted. Jenny Kramer in New Haven in 1881, killed and never convicted. Rose Ambler in Stratford in 1883, 3 women in 10 years, in one small state, dead, and no one ever held to account. 5 years passed. In March of 1888, Norman Ambler was struck and killed by the Washington Express train on a railroad line that ran near his farm. The papers gave it 3 lines. Railroads were by then an ordinary part of country life and an ordinary way to die in country life. Every Connecticut town had its account of a man who had not heard the train, a man who had been drinking, a man whom the bell had not warned. Norman was, by some accounts, all 3. He left the daughter, by then 7, with his widowed mother. The little girl, who had spent her whole life in that farmhouse, would spend the rest of her childhood there. William Lewis stayed in Stratford. He kept the vegetable route. He kept his mother's house. He never married. The new house he had been building for himself and Rose in the autumn of 1883 was finished, and in the end, never lived in. He was, the papers wrote, much disliked. The customers who had crowded his cart in 1883 thinned. The years passed. On the evening of September 27, 1892, William Lewis got into a fight in a barroom in or near Stratford. What the fight was about was not preserved. Someone struck him over the head, hard enough that he went down, got up wrong, and went out into the road home. Somewhere along that road, in the dark, he went down again. Passers-by found him later that night, lying in the dirt. They picked him up and brought him into town and into the hospital, where the doctor on duty examined the back of his head and used the word the press would print the next day: precarious. The skull was fractured. The pressure on what lay underneath was already showing in his speech, which had begun in the carriage on the way over to come loose. It was sometime in the hours that followed that William Lewis began to talk. He was delirious. The fracture had pressed on something that did not want to be pressed on. His words came out the way the words of a head-injured man come out, without sequence, without caution, without the control he had spent 9 years learning to keep. The sources do not preserve the exact wording. The men in the room heard him, remembered the substance, and reported it after. The substance was this: he cried out that he was guilty of murdering Rose. He named her. He claimed the act. He said it more than once. There was a doctor in the room. There were witnesses. The words reached the press within a week, and they were specific enough that no one who had been there mistook them for general delirium. A man with a fractured skull in a hospital bed can say almost anything. He can confess to crimes he did not commit, to crimes no one committed, or speak in fragments listeners afterward assemble into sentences. The medical literature of the period was full of such cases. The men in the room knew it. Connecticut, which had not held him in 1883, did not arrest him in 1892. He recovered. The fracture closed, the pressure eased, the speech came back. He never repeated what he had said in the hospital bed, nor did he deny it. He went on selling vegetables and living in his mother's house. He outlived, eventually, several of the men who had been at his bedside that week. Stratford never decided. The case never decided. He cried out, in the dark of his delirium, that he had killed her. That is what we have.